Before Adolf Hitler had an army, before he had a party, before he had a country, he had one obsession. An obsession so total, so consuming, that it would eventually pull an entire civilization into the abyss. But here's what no history book ever tells you clearly. He was not born hating Jews. Something built that hatred. Something fed it, shaped it, and turned a frustrated, broken young man into the architect of the greatest genocide the modern world has ever witnessed. And that something is a story that begins long before the gas chambers. It begins in a small Austrian town, in the corridors of a crumbling empire, in the trenches of a war that shattered everything, and in the mind of a man who needed someone to blame. This is not just the story of Hitler. It is the story of how hatred is manufactured, how it is planted in the soil of humiliation, watered by propaganda, and harvested by power. And if we do not understand how it began, we will never understand how to stop it from beginning again. He was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small border town between Austria and Germany. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, strict, cold, domineering. His mother, Clara, was the opposite, warm, devoted, almost obsessively protective of her son. The household was tense, often violent. Alois beat his children regularly. Adolf grew up learning that authority was something to fear and that the world outside the home was a battlefield. As a young man, Hitler had one dream: to become a great artist. He spent hours sketching buildings, churches, cityscapes. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts twice, in 1907 and in 1908, and he was rejected both times. The rejection shattered him. He was convinced he was a genius, and the world had failed to recognize it. That wound never fully healed. It festered. Around the same time, his mother died of breast cancer. She was 47 years old. Hitler was devastated. By all accounts, her death affected him more deeply than anything else in his life. Her doctor was Jewish. His name was Edouard Bloch. And here is the remarkable part. Hitler never blamed him. He thanked the doctor. He gave her postcards. Years later, after the annexation of Austria, Bloch was one of the only Jews Hitler personally protected. This detail is critical because it reveals that at this point in his life, Hitler's hatred had not yet crystallized around Jews specifically. But Vienna would change that. After his mother's death, Hitler moved to Vienna with dreams of becoming an artist or an architect. What he found instead was poverty, rejection, and a city seething with political tension. He lived in men's shelters, sold small watercolor postcards to survive, and spent his days wandering the streets or reading newspapers in cafes. He was 19 years old, homeless, directionless, and burning with resentment. Vienna in the early 1900s was a powder keg. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was slowly collapsing. Dozens of ethnicities lived side by side, often in conflict. Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Jews, Romani people. The city was cosmopolitan and chaotic, and that chaos bred anxiety among those who feared losing their place in the social order. It was in Vienna that Hitler first encountered organized political anti-Semitism. The mayor of Vienna at the time was Karl Lueger, a man who had built his entire political career on appealing to the fears of the lower and middle classes, and who regularly used Jews as scapegoats for economic hardship. Lueger did not necessarily believe everything he said. He once reportedly told a critic, "I decide who is a Jew." But he understood the political power of manufactured hatred, and the young, impressionable, resentful Hitler watched and learned. Hitler later wrote in his autobiography, Mein Kampf, that Vienna was where his worldview took shape. He described how he began to see Jews everywhere. In the theater, in journalism, in finance, in the socialist movement. He claimed that one day he encountered a man in a traditional Jewish coat on the streets of Vienna, and it triggered a revelation. He wrote about it as an awakening, but historians are skeptical of this account. Mein Kampf was written as political mythology, not honest autobiography. The transformation was far more gradual, far more influenced by the social environment around him than Hitler wanted to admit. What is clear is that Vienna gave him a vocabulary. a set of ideas that explained, or seemed to explain, why he had failed. He was a genius who had been rejected. The world had not recognized him. And if you needed a reason for that, the anti-Semitic newspapers and pamphlets flooding Vienna were happy to provide one. Jews controlled the art world, they said. Jews control the banks. Jews control the press. Jews were pulling strings from behind the scenes, suppressing real talent, real German talent. For a young man drowning in failure and searching for a story that made sense of his suffering, this narrative was intoxicating. It did not require self-examination. It did not require hard work or humility. It required only that you find the enemy and believe that removing the enemy would restore everything. Hitler left Vienna in 1913 and moved to Munich, Germany, partly to avoid the Austrian military draft. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he volunteered immediately. He was not yet a German citizen, but he petitioned the Bavarian king for special permission to serve. The request was granted. The war gave Hitler something he had never had before: purpose, structure, a sense of belonging. He served as a message runner on the Western Front, a dangerous job that required crossing no man's land under fire. He was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class, one of the highest military decorations of the German army. The award was recommended by a Jewish officer, a fact that Hitler would later bury in silence. For 4 years, Hitler experienced the camaraderie of the trenches, the brutal intimacy of men who depended on each other to survive. He was not popular with his fellow soldiers. They found him strange, humorless, always lecturing about politics, always apart from the group. But he was committed, relentlessly committed. The war was the one thing he believed in completely. And then it ended. In November 1918, Germany surrendered. The armistice was signed, and Hitler, recovering from a gas attack in a military hospital in Pasewalk, received the news and wept. He later described it as the worst moment of his life, worse even than his mother's death. Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield. He convinced himself. The army had not collapsed. The soldiers had not failed. Someone had stabbed them in the back. This was the Dolchstoss legend, the stab-in-the-back myth, and it was already circulating through German military and nationalist circles before Hitler gave it its most famous expression. According to this narrative, Germany had been betrayed from within. Cowards and traitors on the home front had undermined the war effort. Communists, socialists, defeatists. And behind them all, orchestrating the betrayal, pulling the strings, the Jews. There was no truth to this. Germany had lost the war for clear military and economic reasons. The Western Front had broken under Allied pressure. The German economy had been strangled by the British naval blockade. The German population was starving. The army had no more reserves. The war was simply lost. But the stab-in-the-back myth was not about truth. It was about psychological survival. It was far easier for millions of Germans to believe they had been betrayed than to accept that they had fought bravely and still lost. And once you accepted the myth, you needed an enemy to attach it to. For Hitler, that enemy was already waiting. In the chaos of post-war Germany, anti-Semitism was not Hitler's invention. It was the water in which he swam. The streets of Munich were full of pamphlets, meetings, and political movements, all of them searching for someone to blame for Germany's humiliation. Hitler found his way into one such movement, a tiny nationalist group that would become the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known in German as the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or as the world came to know it by its abbreviated name in German, the Nazi Party. What Hitler discovered in the early 1920s was that he had a gift. When he stood up and spoke, people listened. They did not just listen. They were transfixed. He had an extraordinary ability to tap into mass emotion, to give voice to resentment that millions felt but could not articulate. He would begin quietly, almost hesitantly, and then build to a frenzy, his voice rising, his body trembling. The crowd pulled along with him into a state of collective outrage and exaltation. And the message was always the same. Germany had been great. Germany had been betrayed. The enemy was identifiable, and the enemy must be destroyed. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had imposed devastating terms on Germany. The country lost territory, lost its colonies, was forced to accept sole responsibility for starting the war, and was ordered to pay massive reparations to the Allied powers. The German economy, already broken by years of war, was crushed further. Inflation spiraled out of control. In the early 1920s, the German mark became nearly worthless. People needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Middle-class families who had spent decades building savings watched them evaporate overnight. This economic catastrophe was the perfect breeding ground for the politics of scapegoating. And when the Great Depression hit in 1929 and unemployment in Germany rose to over 30%, Hitler's movement found the mass audience it needed. But why Jews specifically? Why not another group? The answer is layered and historical. European anti-Semitism did not begin with Hitler. It had been building for more than 1,000 years. Jews had been blamed for the Black Death, expelled from England, Spain, and dozens of other countries, forced into ghettos, subjected to pogroms, accused of ritual murder, portrayed in art and literature as sinister, greedy, and subhuman. By the time Hitler came along, a vast infrastructure of anti-Jewish prejudice already existed. He did not have to construct the ideology from scratch. He only had to mobilize it. He also exploited two visible realities. First, Jewish communities in Germany, though small, were disproportionately represented in certain professional fields: law, medicine, journalism, banking, the arts. This was largely the result of centuries of discrimination that had blocked Jews from other professions, pushing them toward those few fields where ability and education, rather than land ownership or guild membership, could provide a path to success. Hitler took this reality and twisted it into evidence of conspiracy. Second, a significant portion of the leadership of the German communist and socialist movements were Jewish. Lenin was not Jewish, but several prominent Bolshevik leaders were, and the Russian Revolution had terrified the European upper and middle classes. For Hitler, this was the final piece. He fused the fear of communism with the fear of Jewish power, creating what he called Judeo-Bolshevism, the idea that communism itself was a Jewish weapon designed to destroy Western civilization. This fusion was not logical. The same people who supposedly controlled international capitalism were also supposedly leading the international communist revolution against capitalism. The contradiction was obvious, but conspiracy theories do not require logical consistency. They require emotional power, and Hitler provided that in abundance. In Mein Kampf, published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926, Hitler laid out his worldview with terrifying clarity. He described Jews not as a religious group, not even as a cultural group, but as a biological race, a parasitic species that infiltrated healthy nations and destroyed them from within. He compared them to germs, to viruses, to disease. He argued that the survival of the German people, which he called the Aryan race, depended on eliminating Jewish influence permanently and completely. He also described his vision of living space, which he called Lebensraum, land to be seized in Eastern Europe, where German settlers would build a new empire. The peoples of Eastern Europe, Slavs, Poles, Russians, were in his worldview subhumans, fit only for slave labor or elimination. And the architects of resistance to this German expansion? Again, the Jews. Always the Jews. What makes Mein Kampf so disturbing is not that it is sophisticated. It is not. It is repetitive, rambling, poorly organized, full of internal contradictions. What makes it disturbing is that it is completely honest. Hitler said exactly what he intended to do, and the world, for the most part, did not take him seriously. They thought he was a crank, a fanatic, a temporary phenomenon. They were catastrophically wrong. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, the persecution of Jews began almost immediately, not yet with mass murder, but with systematic exclusion. Jewish civil servants were fired. Jewish lawyers and doctors were barred from practicing. Jewish businesses were boycotted. Jewish children were expelled from schools. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Each step was presented as legal, measured, reasonable. Each step normalized the next. And millions of ordinary Germans went along, some enthusiastically, many passively, and some in quiet horror, but without the courage or the means to resist. The violence escalated. On the night of November 9th, 1938, a coordinated pogrom swept through Germany and Austria. Jewish synagogues were burned. Jewish businesses were smashed. Jewish homes were invaded. Tens of thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The streets were covered in broken glass, and the event was called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. It was not a spontaneous eruption of popular anger. It was organized by the Nazi state, and the world watched. Some protested. Most governments issued carefully worded condemnations, but no country opened its borders. At the Evian Conference in 1938, representatives from 32 nations gathered to discuss the Jewish refugee crisis. Almost none offered to take significant numbers of refugees. Jews trying to flee Germany found doors closing everywhere. The ocean liner St. Louis carried more than 900 Jewish refugees in 1939, seeking asylum in Cuba and then in the United States. Cuba turned them away. The United States turned them away. The ship was forced to return to Europe. Many of its passengers would later die in the Holocaust. Then came the war. And with the war came the final, monstrous escalation. As German forces swept through Poland in September 1939, they found themselves in control of millions of Jews. Mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen followed the army into the Soviet Union after June 1941, shooting Jewish men, women, and children in mass graves across the occupied territories. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kyiv, more than 33,000 Jews were shot in 2 days. Similar massacres happened in hundreds of other locations across Poland, the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. But shooting was slow and psychologically costly, even for those doing the shooting. So the Nazi regime industrialized murder. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, senior Nazi officials gathered in a villa outside Berlin to coordinate what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. Extermination camps were established. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. Jews from across occupied Europe were deported by train and murdered on arrival, most of them in gas chambers. In less than 4 years, 6 million Jews were killed. 1/3 of the entire world Jewish population. 90% of Polish Jews. The scale of industrial murder had no precedent in human history. But we must ask again, where did it begin? Not in the gas chambers. Those were the end, not the beginning. It began in the mind of a failed artist in Vienna, a young man who needed an explanation for his failure and found one ready-made in the anti-Semitic culture around him. It grew in the trenches of the First World War, where defeat was transformed into betrayal. It gathered force in the economic catastrophe of the Weimar Republic, where millions were desperate for someone to blame. It was organized into a political program, legitimized by law, and executed by a state apparatus. The historian Christopher Browning, in his landmark study of one German police battalion involved in mass shootings, found that the men who pulled the triggers were not monsters by birth. They were ordinary men, most of them middle-aged, many of them fathers. They had not been specially selected for cruelty. They had been slowly prepared by years of propaganda, dehumanization, and the social pressure of group conformity. Ordinary men. Extraordinary crime. Hannah Arendt, watching the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, one of the key architects of a deportation system that sent millions to their deaths, famously wrote about the banality of evil. Eichmann was not a sadist. He was a bureaucrat. He filled out forms. He arranged train schedules. He coordinated logistics. He told the court he was just following orders, just doing his job. And in some narrow, horrifying sense, that was true. The Holocaust was not driven only by fanatics. It was enabled by millions of people who looked away, who followed orders, who did not ask questions, who told themselves it was not their problem. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Genocide does not require that every participant be a true believer. It requires only enough true believers at the top to set the machinery in motion, and enough ordinary people below who will not stop it. Hitler's hatred of Jews was many things simultaneously. It was personal, rooted in the psychology of a failed and resentful young man. It was ideological, shaped by a pseudoscientific racial theory that portrayed history as a biological struggle between races. It was political, a tool for mobilizing mass support by providing simple answers to complex problems. And it was cultural, drawing on 1,000 years of European antisemitism that had made Jews a familiar target long before Hitler ever gave a speech. None of these factors alone would have been sufficient. Together, in the specific historical conditions of interwar Germany, a defeated nation humiliated by a punishing peace treaty, devastated by economic collapse, frightened by political chaos, and surrounded by competing extremist movements, they created the conditions for the unthinkable. Understanding this is not about finding excuses. There are no excuses. The Holocaust was a deliberate, systematic, state-organized genocide. The people who designed it and carried it out were responsible for what they did. But understanding how it happened is not the same as excusing it. Understanding how it happened is the only way to ensure that the warning signs, and there were many warning signs, are recognized the next time they appear. The scapegoating of a vulnerable group, the dehumanizing language of politicians and media, the slow, incremental erosion of rights, each step small enough to seem manageable, the silence of those who knew better and said nothing. These patterns did not die with the Third Reich. They are not confined to one century or one country. They are the mechanisms through which human societies have repeatedly descended into atrocity. Hitler did not come to power because Germans were uniquely evil. He came to power because human beings are capable of believing stories that justify their fears, and because the institutions and individuals who could have stopped him failed to do so at every critical moment. The hatred was manufactured, step by step, speech by speech, law by law. And the greatest weapon against manufactured hatred is not outrage after the fact. It is understanding, vigilance, and the refusal to stay silent when the process begins. Because the process does not begin with concentration camps. It begins with words. And it ends only when enough people decide that those words are unacceptable. This is not history. This is a warning. History never gave us the Holocaust all at once. It gave it to us one law, one speech, one silence at a time. And every person who looked away, who said it was not their problem, who decided that the quiet life was worth more than the loud truth, became part of the machinery. What happened was not inevitable. It was chosen, over and over again, by individuals who each believed their single choice did not matter. But it did. Every choice mattered. And that is the most terrifying and the most hopeful truth history has ever given us. If this story stayed with you, then it did what history is supposed to do. It is supposed to make you uncomfortable. It is supposed to make you think. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the stories that the world has tried to forget, the ones that matter most. Leave a comment telling us which chapter of this dark history you want us to explore next. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the past is never as distant as we want it to be. This channel exists because stories like this one must be told.